All right, as you know, we're looking at some of the highlights of Jesus' ministry, and as we've already mentioned, we began by looking at when the good news actually began, which was before anything was created, for God already knew that we would sin, and He already had His plan prepared before the world was ever created. And then we began looking at the first year of His ministry, which was often referred to as the year of Inauguration, and started by considering the baptism of Jesus, followed by His temptation in the wilderness, and later the calling of His first disciples. Next, we homed in on the wedding of Cana of Galilee and all of the symbolism surrounding Jesus' first public miracle and its connection to the good news through that symbolism. Now, last week we looked at Jesus telling Nicodemus he had to be born again, both of water and of the Spirit, in order to see the kingdom of heaven, or enter the kingdom of heaven. This week we're going to take a look at one more highlight from Jesus' first year of inauguration, which is also found in the Gospel of John. And it is another account that we are quite familiar with, if you would. Now, Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that He was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but His disciples. So He left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, He had to go through Samaria. So He came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as He was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to Him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked Him, and He would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to Him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and His worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When He comes, He will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am He." Wow, there's a lot there. So buckle up, hang on, and let's dive in and go back to verses 5 through 9 and get a little bit of context. So if you would. So He came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as He was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was almost about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to Him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For the Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Okay, so let's get some context to this, okay? So the direct route to Galilee from Jerusalem requires Jesus to go through Samaria. I mean, he could have gone around Samaria somewhat, but it would have added probably a couple of weeks to the journey. So the direct route takes him through Samaria. And so as he's going through Samaria, they're tired, and they come to the town of Sychar, where Jacob's well is located, the plot of ground that was given to Joseph and his ancestors when the promised land was divided up and they entered there when they came out of Egypt. And so as Jesus is sitting there, this woman, she comes out from the town, and notice it's noon. Typically, the women would have already come earlier in the day when it was cooler. But because of the type of person she is, she's had all of these husbands. She's obviously someone who probably does not have a good reputation in town. She comes out after it is warmed up and everybody else is gone. And so it's about noontime. And Jesus is sitting there, and he's tired, which gives us an indication he's thirsty, and he asks her for a drink. And the Samaritan woman is taken aback that Jesus would even speak to her. Why? Well, there are two reasons. See, tax collectors were among the very few who were considered to be lower than the Samaritans as far as the Jews were concerned. You see, over the centuries, the Samaritans had intermarried with the Gentiles that had come into the region, and those that they had never actually driven out of Judea. And while the Jews acknowledged that they had a partial Jewish heritage, their bloodline was no longer pure. And so, as a result, if you would, Samaritans were considered outcast stepchildren. And because they had compromised and betrayed their heritage, and that was just short of out-and-out treason as far as the Jews were concerned. And so while the Jews tolerated the Samaritans and when necessary would do business with them, they refused to have much of anything else to do with them for the most part. You see, they were not openly welcome anywhere among the Jews. And while that was their biggest concern, or her biggest concern, the second reason is that they are alone. And if you would, the culture of the day didn't permit men and women to interact privately in this way if they were not married. And that's why the disciples were surprised to find him talking to a woman when they returned later. It just wasn't something you did. And so you have those two things. Number one, you don't associate with a Samaritan, and especially a Samaritan woman alone. You just didn't do those things. And so they're alone at the well, and Jesus begins talking to her. And there's no hesitation in his voice or in his timing. I mean, you kind of picture in your mind, if you lived under that type of culture and you were sitting there at the well, you're thirsty, and this woman is coming out, you might kind of hesitate a little bit and maybe squirm a little before you finally mustered up the courage to finally say, well, would you give me a drink? But not Jesus. As soon as she arrives, will you give me a drink? And she's caught off guard because he has shattered the accepted social norms by asking her for a drink. And not only does he ask because he is tired, indicating he is thirsty, but he also knows the kind of response he will get from the woman. I mean, we got that understanding when Nicodemus came to Jesus, that he already knows what's going to happen. He already knows what's on people's minds. He already knows how they're going to respond, because before Nicodemus ever had a chance to ask the question, what did Jesus do? He answered the question. And so he already knows what is going to take place. He already knows what she is going to say and how she's going to respond. And so it is also a leading question that will open the door for a discussion that will be life-changing for this woman. And so we pick up at verse 10 as we begin to see the interaction that takes place as Jesus begins to teach her, if you would. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." So, the woman at the well, like Nicodemus, thinks Jesus is talking in physical terms. For her, obviously, that would be understandable because, she's not a member of the Jewish ruling council like Nicodemus, who has heard Jesus teaching and should understand that he isn't talking about physical but the spiritual, and didn't. And so, in her defense, she doesn't have that background. And so Jesus' discussion takes on a different format. Rather than reprimand her for not understanding like he did Nicodemus, Jesus begins to teach her the spiritual through physical metaphors. And so his reply bypasses her question and begins with the understanding that everyone gets thirsty over and over again. We all get thirsty. At some point in time, we all get thirsty. Have you ever found yourself, maybe, especially those of you who've been farmers and so on, you're out in the field, you've been working hard, and when you finally come in out of the field, you are thirsty. You want to drink because you've been sweating, and you have begun to kind of head onto the dehydrated side. Maybe you forgot to take your bottle of water with you or something, and you're thirsty. And so she understands this. She understands this concept that everybody gets thirsty. That's why she's at the well, getting water. But she doesn't understand what he means by living water yet. To her, she thinks he's talking about some kind of water that once you get a drink, you don't need any more water. All of a sudden, you've got all the water you'll ever need. You'll never get thirsty again. No more having to come out and draw water out of the well. And depending on how the well was set up, that could have been very difficult. It could have been moderately difficult, depending on how they had designed it to draw the water out. And so she's thinking maybe he has a well that has better water than Jacob's well, but she also makes note that he's got nothing to draw water with. So how's he going to get this water out of this well? And so she asks, "Are you greater than our father Jacob?" In other words, does Jesus have a better well somewhere on perhaps better land? You see, the interesting thing is Jesus is alluding to several prophecies. Some of them, let's take a look at just a few of them real quick. Psalm 46, if you would. "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells." Then there's another one that we've used for Lord's Supper meditation many times, and that's found in Zechariah 13. If you would, "On that day a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity." See, the word translated fountain more directly means water flowing from something dug, such as a well. And so the concept of those is what we understand as being an artesian well. How many of you know what an artesian well is? You know what an artesian well is? It's one where you dig down and there is enough pressure on the water that it actually pushes it up, and you don't have to draw it out. It actually pushes it up out of the ground and begins to overflow. And that's the kind of the picture of what the word means in those passages. That type of a well, an artesian well that just automatically flows without having to even put anything in to draw the water out. He's also talking about the water in the prophecy of the temple in Ezekiel, if you would. "The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar." See, in that prophecy, it is water that gets deeper the farther away from the temple Ezekiel is taken, symbolic of the increased life-giving flow. In other words, the longer the good news is preached, the more people respond to the message. And so Jesus makes the following claims in the Gospel of John many times. And we're familiar with them. John is, you might call it, is the I am gospel. He said, I am the good shepherd. He said, I am the gate. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He said, I am the light of the world. He said, I am the vine. And here Jesus is alluding to the fact that He is the water of life. I mean, He could have very easily made another I am statement here and said, I am the water of life. And so He replies to her, if you would. Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And so He can give her water that will become a spring within her and keep her from ever becoming thirsty again. And in her mind, she's still thinking physical. And so the question becomes, what kind of thirst is He talking about? He's talking about that spiritual thirst that is within each of us. That thirst that there's got to be something more. Now, I was watching a video a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of good, interesting videos out there about people, witnessing to other people and so on and so forth. And I believe it was a video, and I think the street minister was Ray Comfort, and he was talking to an atheist. And, the atheist was basically saying, I don't even believe there's a God. And Ray had an interesting response. He says, yeah, but don't you miss Him? Think about that. Confronting the atheist with the fact that there is built within each one of us that knowing, that understanding there has got to be more. And so even though this atheist was saying, I don't even believe there's a God, Ray Comfort's response was, yeah, but don't you miss Him? In other words, can't you feel that it's true? Can't you feel what's built into you? Can't you sense that spiritual thirst? That spiritual thirst for the eternal, for the things of God. And so He's telling her, if you would, I am the water of life, and I can quench the thirst of your parched spirit for all eternity. And He is that spiritual fountain of life that sustains us in this life and will sustain us eternally in the next life. I mean, when we look in Revelation chapter 22, I believe it is, the first verse. I was up in the opening video about the river in heaven. It is referred to as the river of life. The connection. I am the river of life. I am the water of life. I am that living water. And so, the woman still doesn't understand He's using living water to refer to Himself metaphorically. And so she asked Jesus to give her the water that He can provide, thinking it is a physical water that He's going to draw from some special well, and that she won't have to keep coming to Jacob's well to draw water anymore. I mean, in her mind, hey, this is a good deal. No more carrying the bucket. No more walking all the way out here by myself because the women of the town just don't want to associate with me. Sounds like a good deal to me. Give me some of that water. And what was Jesus' reply? Go get your husband. And we pick up, if you would. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. And things just quickly got very uncomfortable. It had gone from a conversation with a stranger about water to the very personal details of her life. Jesus is commenting on her marital history is significant. Because you see, it's one thing for the people of the town to know what she's like. It's another thing for somebody she has never seen, never talked to. This is the first time she's ever met him, and he already knows the details about her life. She now understands he told her to go get her husband because he already knows that the guy she's with isn't her husband. That they're just cohabitating. And that she's had 5 husbands in the past. And so he's pointing out her need for this spiritual water. Though she still doesn't understand what the living water really is, he's pointing out the need. He's showing her that you've got this spiritual emptiness in you. That's why you've been going through these husbands. That's why your life is the way it is. Go get your husband. I've got no husband. You're right, you don't. Because you need something that I've got. And so what does a person usually do in such a situation when the conversation gets uncomfortable? Well, of course, we change the subject. And much to her amazement, the conversation takes on a whole new twist as we pick up. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and His worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When He comes, He will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am He. A major change was in the process of taking place. She was beginning to understand that this whole conversation wasn't about physical water. It was about her. It was about her lifestyle. It was about her need. Yet it got comfortable. I would say it got uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. So she changed the subject and asked about worship. And now Jesus is talking about, well, worship isn't about a physical location so much either. We're going to talk about that. Worship is about you, about your spiritual condition. See, worship of God was no longer going to be location central. I mean, keep in mind, they had the high places to worship in Samaria and other places, and in Judea they were expected to go to Jerusalem, and they had these locations. And under the old law, whenever you had the festivals, you were required to make the journey to Jerusalem to worship at Jerusalem. And they had this idea that God's presence was only in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was at. I mean, remember in 1 Samuel when the Jews had lost to the Philistines, and they thought it was because they didn't take God with them, and so they went back to get the Ark. Let's go back and get the Ark and take God with us, because wherever the Ark is at, that's where His presence is. And in their mind, the Ark was in the temple, so that's where God was living. He lives in that temple. That's where He's at. That's why we go to Jerusalem for the festivals, so that we can go into the presence of God and worship Him. And so to the Jews, worship centered around the temple. And in some ways, that concept was correct until Christ came, because sin had separated us from God. And throughout the Old Testament, God's presence entered first the tabernacle, and then later the temple when it replaced the tabernacle. I mean, for instance, at the end of the book of Exodus, we read, if you would, then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance to the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And then we get a similar situation when the temple was completed and Solomon dedicated it in 2 Chronicles chapter 5, if you would. The trumpeters and the musicians joined in unison to give praise and thanks to the Lord. Accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments, the singers raised their voices in praise to the Lord and sang, "He is good, His love endures forever." Then the temple of the Lord was filled with the cloud, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud. And for the glory of the Lord filled the temple of God. And then we have the same thing continuing on down in chapter 7, if you would. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled it. And so under the Old Testament or covenant, God seemed to dwell in the temple. That seemed to be where He set up house. And the Jews came to believe that they went to the temple because that is where God lived. But that structure was symbolic and a reminder of the separation between God and man. That was the reason for the curtain that was placed before the most holy place. That specifically was there to show that separation. They weren't allowed to go past it. They weren't allowed to go into God's presence per se. And Jesus is telling the woman at the well that everything is going to change and has already started to change. That concept of the temple being God's house was going to be done away with. And worship was to become understood to not be limited to when they came to Jerusalem for the festivals or went to synagogue every week. You see, worship was to be a lifestyle that isn't limited to the gathering of the people. Worship is to be part of every moment of our lives. And so when Christ died, we read, if you would, and when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, He gave up His spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The price our sin demanded had been paid, and the separation between God and man was removed. And now God dwells within His people. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, if you would, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." Even when he was speaking in Athens, if we go to Acts chapter 17, we read, "God who made the world and everything in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." You, beloved, are God's dwelling place, not a building. And you are sacred to Him. This building where we gather, this is not the Lord's house. You see, if you would, you, His church, are the Lord's house. And that's one thing I hear people use that terminology over and over again. I got a couple of minister friends that use it. They say, "Oh, it's so good to be in the Lord's house today." No. This is the church house. You are the Lord's house. You are His sacred dwelling. Not a physical structure built with hands. He dwells in you and works in you and through you. He has cleansed you and made you holy and placed His presence within you. And our lives are to be lived in worship to Him. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Colossians in chapter 3, if you would, "And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him." And then a few verses later he says, if you would, "And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." You see, everything we do is to bring glory and honor to God. Every moment of our lives is to be lived as an act of worship. Our thoughts, our actions, everything about us. Now, that doesn't negate the need to gather with the body on the first day of the week. We need that gathering. We are created to gather together. We have that need. That's where we draw our strength from. But it does tell us that our worship is not limited to when we do gather. See, somehow we've started getting back to that Old Testament concept that worship only takes place when we gather on Sunday. And the Apostle Paul would tell you, no. Everything you do is to be done as an act of worship to God. Everything you do, everything you think, everything you say should be done in an effort to bring glory and honor to God. Not just what you do on Sunday. Sunday, you might say, is kind of the refueling time, so that you can go out and continue to live a life worthy of your calling, a life filled with worship. Because no matter where we are, no matter who we are with, no matter what we are doing, if you would, our focus is to be on bringing glory to God. The whole idea of what Jesus was trying to get across to the woman at the well, that worship was to be a lifestyle, not a location. Oh, location is important. It is important that we gather. But it's important that we understand that worship doesn't stay at the church building. Worship is to be what takes place every moment of our lives as we strive to present the gospel to the world around us. And when that becomes our focus, when we begin to truly see ourselves as God's temple that is sacred to Him, there will be a big change in what we do, where we go, who we hang out with. Even our mindset will begin to change. I mean, because let's be honest, I think for the most part, most Christians today don't look at themselves and consider themselves to be a sacred dwelling place. I think too often we get too focused on our shortcomings and we forget that God forgives us. God keeps cleaning us up. God cleans house. He's made us sacred. He's made us holy unto Himself and placed His dwelling within us. And our lives will begin to change as we become more like Him. Interesting. We're back to what we talked about last week, that there's to be a change when we are born again. You see, in many ways, Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well was really a continuation of His discussion with Nicodemus. As He was beginning to teach her what being born again was going to be about. That everything would change. That it wasn't going to be about a location. It was going to be about our relationship with God. And when our relationship with Him is right, that living water flows, unending, constantly refreshing our parched spirits as He refreshes us through the trials of life. Oh, there is a well. As the song says, there is a vast supply. And that well flows as we begin to allow our lives to change. As we begin to live lives of worship in all that we do, in all that we say. The well will flow when we offer up our lives to Him. Will you offer up yourself to Him today? To begin to live a life filled with worship in every moment that you live.